Hello and welcome to the Plastic Recycling Podcast. I'm your host, Al Kareem, and today we have a fantastic guest joining us, Marissa Heffernan, editor of Policy Now. In this episode, we're diving into some key policies that are making waves in the recycling industry, especially Eco Modulation and deposit return schemes. If you're working in rPET, curious about the future of sustainable packaging, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Marissa, before we dive into specifics, give us a quick overview of what some of the key policy trends that you've been seeing and what you've been covering in Policy Now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it'll be a shock to no one, but we're seeing a lot of extended producer responsibility, for all kinds of things. We're really concerned. I'm looking a lot about packaging and plastic in particular, but it's popping up for all kinds of materials. So this is definitely a policy style that's here to stay. We're also seeing a lot of modernization of deposit return systems. I haven't seen any new ones yet. It's been a while since we got a new one in the US, but a lot of states, passed these back in the 70s and the 80s, and they're starting to overhaul them, adding new beverage types, increasing deposits, increasing convenience. We're seeing some movement around just other ways to try to handle plastic leaking into the environment. We're seeing, mandates to use a certain amount of post-consumer resin. We're seeing perhaps reuse mandates or lightweighting mandates, reduction mandates. Sometimes those are wrapped into EPR bills and sometimes they're standalone. But we're really seeing a lot of policymakers looking pretty closely at the plastics industry, the packaging industry, and what can be done to try to reduce some of the environmental impacts.
And this is a state by state initiative, right? All of these policies. Give us an overall kind of zoomed out perspective. Where do some of these bills stand? Which states are moving faster than others? And then I think more importantly, are you starting to see things being passed? Are they at initial stages? And are we starting to see recycling rates inch up? What does that timeline possibly look like? I know I'm tacking a lot of questions at you, but I'm just very curious on, we hear about these really cool things, but do we actually see them working on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. We had 4 states, 2 and 2 in 2 years, in 21 and 22, pass extended producer responsibility for packaging, Maine, Colorado, California, and Oregon. And then this past year, Minnesota kind of snuck it into a budget bill. I had stopped actually monitoring Minnesota because I thought some legislative deadlines had passed. And then all of a sudden it popped back up and people were calling me and they're like, "Did you see what just happened in Minnesota?" And I was like, "No." Um, so then Minnesota got in there as well with EPR. There's definitely a lot of activity. New York's been trying to pass EPR for years now. Washington State has been trying to pass a combined DRS EPR bill. Tennessee's been working on EPR for packaging. It's popping up. I'm thinking, what states? Maine also has EPR. I think I might have messed that up a little bit earlier, but it's California, Maine, Colorado, and Oregon. I'm
Okay.
from Maine, so I can't not call out my home state. We're seeing a lot of activity on it. These are big bills. They're really complex bills. A lot of people are touched by them. A lot of people want a say and should have a say in how they're passed and how they're shaped and the language in there. So they typically take a couple years from introduction to passage with a lot of compromise and a lot of sit down meetings. They can get pretty contentious, but I think that each state has put forth a slightly different model now that has passed EPR. And we're starting to see, Minnesota's bill really mirrored Washington, even though they haven't passed one yet. It mirrored the draft text. It mirrored Colorado and California quite a bit, Oregon. So we are starting to see, I think, maybe folks pick a pathway and say, okay, we're gonna try this style of packaging EPR. Yeah, it's all state by state. We are not going to be seeing anything at the federal level. Someone on stage at a conference recently said, the U.S. is built on federalism. We are set up for states to do their own thing. And if they can do their own thing, they're going to.
Yeah.
So I'm not so sure about anything at the federal level, but there's a lot of activity. It's a really active sector right now.
It's encouraging. That's encouraging. And are you seeing, you talked a little bit about deposit schemes. a little bit about eco modulation, which we'll expand on. Are you seeing those being integrated into the EPR bills, or are they separate? What does that look like?
Yeah, eco modulation has been pretty baked into EPR bills at this point, which is pretty common around the world. The US is adding quite a bit into their EPR bills that some folks in Europe are saying, I don't know if I'd call that pure EPR. You've got a lot of stuff in there, but eco modulation is pretty common to include in EPR. And we've seen it in all the bills that have passed here and all the ones that have been introduced. DRS, a little bit different. Washington has been trying with their RAP Act for a few years now to pass a combined system because, studies are showing that it's very effective to have both these systems running at once. That's an even bigger bill. That's, because then not only are you suggesting a change to possibly collection, but you're essentially removing a high value stream from MRFs. There's a lot of talking to be done there. There's a lot of worry. There's a lot that has to be worked out. For DRS, I think we're seeing more states just tweaking, updating, adding something, beyond maybe PET or aluminum cans, different beverage types, increasing deposits from 5 to 10 cents, adding convenience standards. A lot of the DRS activity is modernization over new bills. But if Washington passes the RAP Act, it'd be really interesting to see a state try to roll those both out at once and what it might look like, especially because Oregon has, one of the highest return rates for DRS in the nation. And there's a lot of crosstalk between Washington and Oregon if you live on that border. So it could be really beneficial to both states' redemption rates. That's just a heavy lift to ask legislators to do.
Yeah. Okay. Marissa, let's take a step back because we did a whole different podcast on EPR, but maybe you can, in a quick nutshell, what is EPR? What is DRS? What is eco modulation? And then I want to dive a little bit deeper into DRS, eco modulation, and kind of go into the specifics. So let's kind of start there, take a step back, start there, and then go a bit deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. So EPR, extended producer responsibility, kind of how it sounds. It's kind of taking our current system that says, producers make something, consumers use it, and now largely the cost of end-of-life management is falling to municipalities. It's the city you live in. They're handling it. As packaging has really proliferated, that's become a big issue, a big burden on sometimes really small towns that don't have it in their budget to be handling this. So extended producer responsibility is saying, well, the producers are responsible for the costs, for taking this package back, for paying for its management, whether that's recycling or landfilling, whatever it takes, this should actually be their responsibility. And part of the reasoning behind that is because a lot of things produced today are not made in a way to be easily recyclable, or, they become litter quite easily. So it's also kind of hoping to push design in a direction that is a bit easier to manage, and doing so by saying, well, the easiest way to do this is to make them financially responsible, because then they'll have some skin in the game and be motivated to work on these things. Eco modulation work on a very similar wavelength, that it's saying, if you make changes to your packaging to make it more recyclable, less damaging to the environment, perhaps, mono material, so it's a little easier to handle, you'll pay fewer fees. We'll reduce your fees. Whereas if you say, I'm going to make a carbon black package with 13 tiny little pieces, you're going to be paying a lot more in fees. And, some companies might say that's okay. I'll pay the fee. I want my package to look like this. But the hope here is that most companies will say, okay, I'm going to move in a direction that will reduce my fees and then kind of clean up and improve the recycling of this package. France in particular has a really interesting study on reducing carbon black via eco-modulated fees that was quite successful in a couple years. And then DRS, commonly known as bottle bills. I grew up in Maine. I remember as a kid collecting the bottles for 5 cents and turning them in and then going and buying candy with it or something. But essentially that one works where when you buy a beverage at the store covered by the bottle bill, you pay a 5 cent or 10 cent deposit up front. And then you can return that bottle when it's empty to a facility and get that deposit back. There's a lot of different ways to modernize it. There's a lot of things we've learned about the way to make it most effective. But typically, bottle bill states have much higher beverage container, but much higher recycling rates in those categories in states without them, just because it gives you that little, there's value here.
That's very cool. So let's dive a little bit more into eco modulation. How are these? So you set the stage up for us. We kind of understand a little bit more about what eco modulation is, but how is it actually being administered? How is it being monitored? What does that look like?
Yes, that's the tricky part. Typically, the way the system works is you have companies apply if they want the bonus. So then they're submitting, they're saying, hey, I've done these things, I meet these thresholds. And then the agency or the state, whoever's administrating it, the PRO, can look and say, yes, you have, you'll receive a reduction of this amount. Um, and then in terms of the penalties or the malices, that I think more comes up just in general surveying of, these companies do have to report. They have to report every year what kind of packaging they're using, how much of it, where it's going, changes they're making. So that's the malices. Typically a company probably wouldn't want to report, submitted paperwork saying, I made a choice that you don't like. So that will come out in those reports. And then the malices will be applied through there, again, typically by the producer responsibility organization or the PRO.
Okay. So is it on the PRO, which essentially, so you have EPR, right? And EPR is not administered by the municipality. All of the manufacturers are getting together and saying, we're going to govern ourselves and we're going to put money into this external organization. We're going to monitor it. So it's self-regulation in the industry, essentially. And that's what we call a PRO, correct? They administer all the EPR and the eco modulation. Now, I guess one question I have around that is there not a conflict of interest? Because obviously you are monitoring yourself and therefore you have some sort of clash. But of course, everybody wants a level playing field. And that's what, in competition, you want that. You want everybody to have the same rules. And then cool, if everybody is adhering to those rules, it works. So talk to me a little bit about that conflict of interest. And then how does all of that administering happen? How does the state then monitor the PRO to know that they are actually enforcing the standards that the bill needs them to enforce?
Yeah, exactly. And that is sort of the big complaint or concern about the PRO system. Maine is doing something a little different. Oregon too, slightly. Those states retain a little more state and agency control. Maine in particular is technically, I believe, the agency oversees the program and the PRO is doing maybe some more administrative, but they're a bit of an outlier in that. But yes, there is a lot of concern because you're saying, go ahead and watchdog yourselves, essentially. But like you touched on, a lot of that relies on the fact that if you're paying fees and you see that your competitor is not paying fees, you are going to speak up about that.
Absolutely.
The competition is strong. And a lot of the bills we're seeing have pretty strict reporting standards. They're pretty prescriptive in many ways in what the PRO can and can't do, what it has to report. And it does typically give some pretty strong state oversight or agency oversight into that. Many of EPR bills we've seen passed also have sections of bill language that say if we find the PRO is not performing how we want, or if there's a problem with it, the state is allowed to come in and take over and either form a new PRO or force them to make some changes. So the bills do have some sort of punitive and regulatory language written into them to try to avoid a situation, where you have a group run by industry kind of doing what they want with industry. There have been packaging PROs all over the world for a long time. The US is pretty behind in this. Canada, BC has been doing this for decades. And, I think there have been a few issues here and there, but largely I think based on that competition idea, it has worked. Some states allow for multiple PROs after the first couple of years so that you could actually have, if, some folks in there think, this is not being run the way I'd like, they can split up on their own competing PRO. Not all states allow for that. Not all countries allow for that, but a few here do open that up as an option after I think like 3 years or 5 years.
Yeah. So it's essentially the PRO's responsibility to find all the packaging you use, packaging producers. They'll sign all of them up for the PRO because it's mandated by legislation. And then the PRO will enforce each of these manufacturers to report on the number and therefore pay into the PRO. And so where does all of that money go from the PRO? How does that help to boost recycling? Talk to me about that last piece of the link.
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll be seeing a lot of that in infrastructure upgrades and collection upgrades, which of course is, the big question is everyone says, well, how come I can recycle this thing, but not this thing? And three towns over, it's the opposite. And it completely depends on where your material is getting sent. Does that MRF have an optical sorter? Are they doing a hand sort? It's quite the patchwork. So a lot of the money is kind of earmarked into getting upgraded equipment, doing the best in class things we know reduce contamination and really make cleaner bales and boost capture rates. You'll see a lot of it there. Reimbursements to local governments who are paying or have been paying the burden on these things. You'll see some money going. A lot have some money earmarked for R&D. So what are some new things we could do? Let's test some new packaging, test some new equipment, stuff like that. And then California actually has a pollution mitigation fund as part of their EPR, which is also pretty unique. That is going to be money going in to help clean up historic pollution from packaging in disadvantaged or overburdened communities. And that is, I don't quite remember the sum, but it's a pretty large number. So that'll also be interesting to see. That's California bringing in kind of a different aspect to this and kind of acknowledging that historically pollution hits certain communities far over others. And also saying you guys have to account for that and have to pay to help clean some of that up.
Very interesting. In terms of those states that have had EPR, eco modulation regulation for a long time, do you see that translating into higher recycling rates?
Yeah, we certainly do in Canada. So far in the US, none of the states that have passed it have fully rolled it out. I think the first one's coming. Oregon starts, I think, in July 25. So that's coming up. A lot of them come online 26, 27, 28, just because it's a short timeline in terms of setting up a program like this. But also, people said we can't give a decade to get this rolled out, right? Like this needs to happen pretty quickly. So I'm watching all of those implementation meetings, and they are putting in a truly wild amount of work to come up with these systems and implement them in these communities that are a little bit different. But yeah, Canada, especially, looking at BC, places that have had pretty comprehensive and wide-ranging EPR for packaging for quite a while, their rates just absolutely blow us out of the water, which, isn't super hard to do because Colorado, after passing their EPR law, their recycling rates were quite low, which was the big driver where they said, we're doing all this other stuff in Colorado. And yet, our rates are in the 30s right now, and we can and should really get this up. So it will be interesting to see over the next couple of years, especially as they roll out slightly programs, how exactly those rates respond.
For eco modulation, do you have any real kind of examples on how you've seen the shift in packaging that was not recyclable, multi-layer, to something that's now very easy to recycle?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, in France, I was listening to a webinar about a year ago, and they've been doing EPR for packaging and eco modulation for quite a while. But it had been kind of known that the way they had rolled out eco modulation wasn't really effective. It wasn't providing the pressures they were hoping to, because they were leaning a bit heavier on the bonus side. And then recently they overhauled their EPR a little bit, especially around eco modulation. A great example was black packaging, carbon black packaging, which is not really sortable. If it gets in there, it'll ruin your color for the rest of the bale. And so they imposed a pretty steep malus that kind of ramped up over, I believe, 3 years. So they said, hey, it's coming. You better start transitioning away. Okay, now it's, 25%, now it's 50%, now it's 100%. And they saw a significant decline in companies using black packaging and, carbon black, because they saw it coming and they had the time to do the research and to make the switch. There were still a couple, I think, maybe 1,000 tons of it coming into the system every year, but they said that they expected that to continue to decline just because it's hitting bottom lines, and companies are saying, okay, how let's pick a different color. Let's pick a different tray. Let's make a change here. So yeah, I think that it's certainly something that still requires a little bit of tweaking to figure out, but some other countries are having some pretty good luck affecting the changes they want.
Do you feel that there is space for a producer to look at this legislation, to look at all of these laws and use it as an advantage in terms of packaging design, packaging sustainability? How do you gain a competitive edge looking at all of this as a producer, as a recycler, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, definitely if you've already been doing some of these design things, because a lot of these design elements, they're not pulling them out of thin air. They're based on, perhaps like the APR design guide or best practices that have already been out there. So some companies are saying, well, I've been doing this. So they're going to come in not needing to make this many changes, maybe getting a bonus instead of analysis first couple of years.
Mm.
And then I think there's also an element, we hear a lot about greenwashing nowadays. Consumers are getting kind of skeptical when you say, well, mine's recycled or mine's recyclable or mine's green. People are starting to be like, I don't know, is it? But, when you're in a system where it's being checked, it's being verified, I think that'll
Mhm.
also add a little bit of, consumers say, oh, well, if the PRO says this brand, if the state says this brand actually is making great design choices, there's a little more trust there because it's regulated. So much of the claims out there are completely unregulated that I think that it's an easier story to tell when you're trying to tell your story of sustainability as a brand or the choices you're making. It gives a kind of a framework to hang that story on and say, and the state agrees and they're giving me a discount because of it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, now that's insightful. Let's switch focus into deposit return schemes. Bottle bills is what it's also called. Of course, you touched a little bit upon how this works, but from what I understand is there will be laws statewide which mandate at the point of sale for a charging of 5 cents or 10 cents for that type of bottle. And then everywhere you buy a bottle, you're going to be charged 5 cents or 10
Mhm.
cents. My assumption is the bottleneck to rolling this out would be having enough places to return the bottle. How has that been coming along? And also talk to us about a zoomed out approach of how many states have done this so far. How has that impacted recycling rates? Obviously, there's a lot of overhaul going on, but this is something that's been around for much longer than EPR as well as eco modulation.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a handful of states, I'd say no more than a dozen, that have these laws on the books. And the convenience and the places to return them are absolutely the sticking point, especially, California, Iowa started overhauling their bottle bills specifically because the rates had not changed in so long. More redemption centers were closing. They couldn't stay in business because you have the 5 cents that the consumer pays. And out of that, some of it goes to the redemption center, a handling fee to help them stay open. And, when the handling fee that we passed in the 70s is not quite sufficient to keep a company in 2024 open. Um, so you were seeing redemption centers just closing because they couldn't afford to stay open. And then, sometimes you'd have half the state that had no real way to get their money back, which, consumers don't like because they're paying for it and they're not about to drive 3 hours to the nearest redemption center to get their $20 in cans back. So we've seen a lot of overhaul around increasing the deposit and then increasing the percentage of that goes to the redemption centers to help them stay open. California also has some other laws kind of wrapped up in that, increasing, payments to them to help them through harder years or harder months. Because California was also hit particularly hard with redemption centers closing. I think they had lost like 50% of them in a handful of years over the last decade. So, they were like, we really need to do something because often, if you do polls, consumers love bottle bills. They're really supported and it's not partisan. People really like bottle bills. And schools, I did it, like I said, I bought candy with it, but also like my hockey team would go around and say, can we have your bottles? And then, we'd buy gear with it. It's a really community-based thing, and a lot of people get behind it. Making sure that they can access it is huge. And we're seeing a lot of movement towards new technologies. Oregon is doing quite a bit with, instead of having to go to a reverse vending machine and put them in one by one, you buy a special kind of bag and put your code or your label on it, and then you fill it and drop it off, between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. at hundreds of places around the state, just into a big shipping container. And then it gets added to my account. So we're seeing a lot of kind of innovation in technology and convenience, and also kind of understanding that different people like to return things different ways. Some people want to see it counted in front of them. And some people like me, I'm like, whoa, there we go. Check it off the to-do list. And that's not my problem anymore. So that's been really interesting. And then, yeah, kind of a larger view. It is interesting too, because this is also a space where we have seen quite the shift in producers going from opposition to support. Because, Coca-Cola, a lot of the big ones used to say, oh, this is an extra step, right? Like we're not really interested in this, but now they have every bottle back and they want to be able to report high recycling rates of their bottles. And the way to do that is DRS. So we've also seen a really interesting shift in producers saying, actually, I can't get enough PCR and I want a bottle bill. Some of them are advocating for, nationwide, which, like I said, I don't know if we'll see that, but they're saying it'd be easier. We get a whole thing set up across the US, everyone could access it, but that's quite the tall order.
I mean, it's just so exciting. If you think like 10 years ago, none of this was anywhere close to anybody's radar. But now there's activity, there's producers pushing for like, please give me my bottle back. Like I really need it. It's such an exciting space to be in. With that, and to close off, where do you see this going? How do you see this moving over the next 5 years, 10 years? As you mentioned, things like EPR bills, it takes time. It takes 2, 3, 4, 5 years for them to come into space, start to move, start to have those PROs really functioning. And really, we don't really have that much time. Where do you see this going? Do you see that there's more urgency? Do you see that there's more technology coming in that might enable faster speed? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think we are going to start to see some acceleration. You have the vanguard states, the ones who say, we don't really know what we're doing, but we're going to do it anyway. And then you have a lot of states who go, I'm going to watch what they're doing and see how that turns out for them. And I think this is a bit unique because you are having producers in charge of it, and a lot of them are under a Circular Action Alliance. So it's really the same PRO across, which in terms of efficiencies and scale, it could be huge because you'll see it in these 5 states, and then maybe other states will say, okay, that seems to be working pretty well. And at that point, CIA will be able to say, okay, here's, drag and drop, essentially. We'll adjust it a little bit for your state, your needs. Are you mountainous? What do you need? But we've done it. And the producers know how to report now, and they know, how to put their data in and what they need to do. So I do think that in 5 years, it might be a little easier once the bill is passed to get these up and running, depending on what specifics are in the bill. I do think we're seeing a lot of technology in terms of sortation, in terms of being able to make really clean bales of pretty specific materials. I think that we might see some spillover in states that aren't necessarily under EPR. These are producers that are operating in all the states. And no one's going to change packaging just so it's more recyclable in California, right? They're going to change their packaging across the board. So we'll see a little bump from that. A lot of the haulers too, there's some really big haulers that'll be getting these investments to upgrade their facilities. And it's not a great business model to say, well, we'll make that one really nice and we'll let this one fall apart. So I think we'll also see some crossover where they'll say, oh, that worked really well. And even though maybe in this state, I have to make the investment on my own, the return is worth it because I'm getting a cleaner bale, I'm getting more materials, and I'll make it back. So I do think there's going to be ripple effects out, not just in the states that have directly passed this. The timeline is the challenge. Like you said, we don't really have 15 years to be like, yeah, I think maybe we'll do more of this. But I also think that brands, consumers, legislators are hearing that pretty loud and clear from people. For the first time, we've got plastic being talked about at the international level, at the UN, we're talking about this. So, I don't think that's a trend that can be reversed. I think this is an issue that's going to continue to be kind of a big issue for people moving forward, perhaps as they start to see what EPR can do and the different methods we have and technologies, DRS. There might be more kind of grassroots on the ground agitation from folks saying, I want this in my state. How do we make this happen?
A lot of compounding, essentially.
And
So
there's a
you're
lot.
starting to see that beginning of that curve. Yeah. Right. True. Yeah. That's very, very helpful, Marissa. It's been so fun speaking with you. It's been a really nice zoomed out approach and then really in the details as well. And for you to clarify everything for us, I so much appreciate it. I learned a lot. It was great having you on. Perhaps you can tell the listeners where we can find you, how we can subscribe to your lovely newsletter, and then we can bye.
Beautiful. Yeah, so I work for Resource Recycling. As you've referenced, Policy Now is a newsletter that I created because I really love policy and want to keep talking about it, love talking about it. So if you go to resourcerecycling.com, you can sign up for our weekly newsletters, or you can sign up for Policy Now, which is monthly, and you'll get a bunch of stories written by myself and my colleagues all about what's happening in the industry. What's the big news? Where is it going? What's affecting us? And what can you do and where do you fit in? So that's where I'm at.
That's perfect. Thanks, Marissa. Lovely speaking with you, and hopefully you'll be on again.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the invite.
Dang.